All right, everyone, we're back at the Digital Currency Summit with another amazing guest. We've got with us Matt Cutler, the co-founder and CEO of Blocknative. Matt, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Give us your origin story into this industry. What were you doing before, and what was that aha moment where you had to stop what you were doing and pivot and run into crypto?
Well, I always like to say I'm a glutton for punishment because I've done 7 or 8 startups, depending on how you count. I've built them, grown them, sold them, split them, shut them down, taken them public, all of the above. My very first one was actually an internet company back in 1994, long before it was fashionable to do internet companies and long before it was fashionable to do them as an undergrad. That one was a 9-year overnight success, zero to IPO. And my last company, my most recent one, was a mobile collaboration platform that got bought by Cisco. That's why I live out here in the Bay Area as part of that deal. And I was at Cisco, and one of my good friends said, "Matt, you really need to tune into crypto. Something's happening." And I was like, "I'm busy." And then about 6 months later, he'd come back and he'd say, "Dude, you really got to start paying attention." And I said, "I'm busy." And eventually he was persistent. I started to pay attention about 2016, started to hold a few things. And immediately I understood, I've seen this movie before. It feels exactly like the internet in 1996, 97. And gosh, how unlikely that an operator like me would have 2 bites at the apple, get the chance to work in the early days of the internet and now get a chance to work in the early days of crypto. And so shortly thereafter, I wound up leaving a big corporate job at Cisco and starting a brand new company that was run from scratch. And it's been a blast ever since.
That's incredible. I knew we were going to get along from the very first moment. I have a similar background, though much less lower, not a Silicon Valley vet whatsoever. Failure after failure after failure as an entrepreneur, and finally crypto hit, and that's where I finally found where I belong. And it seems like you have as well. Tell us about Blocknative and what you're building here, and the whole story behind that.
So we at Blocknative are specialists in-flight transactions on public blockchain networks, value in motion. So if you think about data that goes on chain, all the values at rest, the money stop moving. We specialize in the area above, the pre-chain layer, the pre-consensus layer, as sort of the money is in flight, the value is in flight. Technically, it's known as the mempool, and we've been working on this problem for 3+ years now. And it's actually a pretty tricky problem because it's a global real-time system with no truth to it, meaning it's before truth is formed. So it's a very tricky problem technically. It requires very large infrastructure, but the consequences are fairly profound because the rules of value in motion are very different than value at rest. So you can change things, you can respond to things. And so we've gone from just a couple of customers to 300 plus customers over the course of the past 12 months. We have a range of offerings to help people make sense of value in motion in public blockchain networks. We work with top builders in the space. They work with the top traders in the space. They work increasingly with top traditional finance, and they use our infrastructure to improve user experience, to do protocol monitoring and protection, and to enable new types of trading strategies. And it's kind of core infrastructure, so people build all sorts of interesting and unusual stuff on top of it, and it's super fun to participate in.
Well, let's break down mempool for a second, because this is a topic that we've never talked about on our summits before. So if there's listeners that are here for the first time or even have tuned into all of our summits, they're thinking to themselves, wait, what? So let's talk about the mempool. Bitcoin has a mempool, Ethereum has a mempool, and what this is, like you mentioned, it's transactions that are pending. It's still confirming. It hasn't fully been accepted by the blockchain yet, and there's some wiggle room in there for potential manipulation. What are some of the, I guess, things that you've noticed that could be potential problems that Blocknative has worked to address at a high
Sure.
level?
So for folks who are new to this whole domain, what I always say is, if you're ever doing a blockchain transaction, again, Bitcoin, Ethereum, or anything else, you submit the transaction, you wait for a while, and then it confirms or doesn't. Like, what happens while you're waiting for a while? I don't really know. It turns out your transaction is broadcast to the network, and it becomes a candidate for inclusion. And you're basically competing for minor attention to include your transaction in a block and for it to go on chain and become truth. The challenge is you're competing with every other pending transaction in the world, and the mempool itself will generally contain tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pending transactions, and every block only contains a few hundred at most. Okay, and so it's a pretty tricky place to operate. Different blockchains have different rules, have different mechanics, different things about it, but it's the thing that happens before your transaction goes on chain, and it is because it's before consensus is formed, you can change things. So you can replace transactions in the mempool, you can speed them up, you can cancel them, you can change their parameters, you can create a transaction based on someone else's transaction that's in the mempool, and then they can respond to yours, and you can go back and forth, and you can have various forms of competition that occur before any of this occurs. Many attacks and exploits you first can pick up in the mempool. You can know that something negative is going to happen in the next 15 seconds or so, or sometimes longer. You can see trades or transactions that are going to move the price of an asset. You could see someone else's trade, and you can move the price of the asset before and after to profit from that. So it kind of is just sort of this new battleground for settlement. And there are lots of tricks that can be done both to ensure that you get predictable settlement, your transaction completes on time, your transaction completes at reasonable cost, and your transaction has reasonable terms of settlement. But to do so, because it's a real-time environment, everything's changing all at once. So you have to look at inside the mempool to know what's going on. So you can therefore say, here's what I should do next to get the following outcome that I want. Turns out, again, it's a tricky problem. It's a very fast problem. And that's why specialists like us have emerged to provide infrastructure for folks to work with it.
That's fantastic. Great explanation. So from your vantage point, we've got a lot of transactions now that, maybe there's no room in the mempool at some point. So there's been this emergence of layer twos. Polygon, Loop Ring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lightning Network for Bitcoin. What extra challenges or opportunities are now moved over to layer 2 compared to the final mempool? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it just now we're trading in 3D as opposed to 2D? How do you look at it?
I always like to talk about it as you're just making trade-offs, right? So again, for your listeners who are not super familiar with layer twos, it's sort of like one way to think about it is like a bar tab. I buy a drink, you buy a drink, I buy a drink, you buy a drink. It's a lot of back and forth, or we just open up a tab, we transact very quickly, and at the end of the night, we settle out, right? So it's a more efficient way to batch together transactions. You can have faster transactions at lower fees on average because they're grouped together. But at the end of the night, you got to make sure you settle out, right? And so there are additional risks that can come with layer 2 transactions versus layer 1. So there's a trade-off. You trade one set of things off for another. And we think this is very healthy for the ecosystem. They've been growing very rapidly. But by the way, layer 2s have mempools as well. And so, just like you have to be a candidate for inclusion on layer 1 Ethereum or layer 1 Bitcoin, you also have to be a candidate for inclusion elsewhere. And there's different rules. So basically, like how Lightning Network works is quite a bit different than the way Polygon works, for instance. And so there's different types of layer 2s. They have different characteristics and properties. And as far as we're concerned at Blocknative, they all just represent complexity. And as someone who's trying to get something done in a public blockchain network, there is just ever increasing complexity of ways I can do things, risks I'm taking, things I didn't expect. And we at Blocknative basically help people who are transacting navigate those risks with confidence. So you know what's going on, you know what to expect. And if something needs your attention, you know how to intervene.
From the perspective of a mempool specialist and all the different games that can be played inside that, is there any difference between the chain being proof of work versus proof of stake, or some other flavor of proof of stake that makes mempool games either less complex, more straightforward, or where do you lie on that ongoing argument?
So again, it's just a matter of trade-offs, right? So there's no black or white here. There's no better or worse. They all have different characteristics with different, again, pros and cons. So yes, mempool dynamics and proof of stake systems are different than mempool dynamics and proof of work, but that doesn't mean there's not additional dynamics. It doesn't mean you can't look inside. Again, by definition, you need a public place where transactions can go, where all the miners can try to include them in a block. There's the emergence, what's certainly happening in the world of Ethereum are called private mempools, sort of private relays, where it doesn't get broadcast out, but it goes only to specific miners. And there's, again, pros and cons of that. Now you have centralized third parties who can also do things with your transactions. And there's all sorts of, the rabbit hole sort of never ends here. My view of this is overall sophistication is growing around mempool games and some of the challenges that can happen there. And both layer one and layer two solutions, as well as protocols themselves, are building in protections to provide, general users that they're less likely to have unexpected things happen. So overall, we think this is pretty constructive for the whole industry. And I think over time, there will be, a cat and mouse game between, hey, we solved this problem, up this new form of, it's called MEV, minor extractable value, or maximal extractable value, sort of starts to emerge. But again, this is all forms which are part of this emerging marketplace that we're all a part of. And that's what makes it super fun for deep technologists like us to build real infrastructure.
Going back to what you were saying a little bit earlier about the early days of the internet and crypto reminding you of that, and it's kind of like the old protocol wars where you had TCP/IP, which is what we all use now, but there was NetBIOS and some other stuff back in the day that no one remembers. Right. Do you think there's going to be a dominant crypto protocol where 99% of all the other layer ones go away and finally we have some data standards? Or is it going to be really a hodgepodge mix of the internet at the hardware layer where, maybe Ethereum is like concentric.net back in the day, and you've got Solana that's GTI, and then, somewhere else is Global Crossing, and eventually they have to kind of patch these things together?
It's really interesting. And if you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said it seems likely we're going to live in a multi-chain future. There'll be more than one chain that matters, but that there'll probably be a fairly small number of chains that matter. So just a handful or so. But more recently, in the past 6 months, it's become pretty obvious that there is demand for many chains. And we're seeing real adoption of all sorts of L1s and L2s, and that seems to be accelerating. And I think the pattern that we're seeing is as DeFi in particular, and also NFTs move and are available on other smart contract chains, that there's demand there because it's cheaper to transact there, because it's faster to transact, because there's more profitable opportunities because it's not as crowded. And then what happens is money flows in, people flow in, transactions flow in, and it gets less profitable. It gets less easy to transact because there's more there. And so my view is I don't think that the end users seem particularly loyal to any one or other chain. They're looking for efficiency. They're looking for fast transactions, looking for cheap transactions with clear terms of settlement. And it's clear to me that there are many chains that can offer that. So personally, I believe we're going to live in a multi-chain future. There will be many chains that matter. And I also believe we're going to live in a cross-chain future where these chains will talk to each other, as you mentioned. This will create sort of arbitrary complexity for settlement. You can tell me I want to swap ETH for USDC, and I can say there's 3,000 ways to conduct that transaction. And you will say, look, just give me the best one. And I'll say, what do you mean is best? And you'll say, well, I'm willing to pay this much. I want this exchange rate, and I'm willing to wait this long. And you go, oh, okay, right now, here's the way to do that. Okay. And so we see that there's exploding choice happening for users. That's healthy for the ecosystem. Probably not infinite, but probably bigger than most people expect.
That's a great answer. And while I was thinking that, you mentioned fast, cheap. You can't talk about fast and cheap without talking about non-blockchain alternatives like IOTA's Tangle and other DAG programs, or potentially a hash graph or some of these other things. Do those also have mempools just like blockchains, similar complexities and trade-offs, or are those completely different beasts?
Well, so I don't know the ins and outs of every single one of them because there are many.
What do we have you here for? What?
Exactly. What I would say is if you had a blockchain that anyone could write anything arbitrary without anybody looking at it, wouldn't be a very useful blockchain, would it? Like, you need the opportunity. The network needs the opportunity to inspect the transaction, make sure it's valid, make sure it sort of agrees, make sure that you can update balances. And so you kind of need this area. By the way, you swipe a credit card, you wait a while, it says, oh, clear. Like, what's happening, right? It's doing a whole series of checks to make sure that it's a valid transaction. You trade a stock, it says, order received, right? Order fulfilled, right? Hey, settled. There's steps to this, right? So all transaction systems have these characteristics where you need a a period of time to evaluate the transactions that you're going to write down and become permanent. So in general, yeah, absolutely, independent of whether it's centralized or decentralized or anywhere on the spectrum they're in, there's no sort of magic solution, because otherwise people can lie. People can say they have things that they don't. People can steal things that they otherwise couldn't, and that's not going to be a very useful blockchain at all. Okay.
Yeah. And you mentioned trade-offs. You've got speed and finality versus security. Bitcoin's got, eons, like quite literally eons of transaction hashes per block to prove that it is telling the truth and the final truth. Versus Solana, which is settling in, just a matter of seconds or less, hundreds of thousands of transactions. For a use case like Solana, it makes sense for like DeFi and high frequency trading, or maybe some other things. But where is kind of like an acceptable middle ground where you feel like, well, this is enough security for me to feel safe and sleep at night, but I also don't have to wait around during my entire lunch break to pay for it?
Yeah, so this is, I think Vitalik Buterin sort of called it the trilemma, and the three legs are security, throughput, and decentralization. Pick two, right? And so Bitcoin is a great example of the largest public blockchain and the furthest out on the decentralization realm. That's really the core, and they consistently, that ecosystem has consistently made decisions that favor decentralization at the expense of all else. Right? If you look at other chains like Solana, they're highly centralized, and so the result of high degrees of centralization is you can run very large computing power behind it, so you get higher throughput and potentially high security. Again, I'm not one to comment on the specific aspects of it, but at the expense of decentralization, and therefore is more censorable, as you will. And the answer, of course, is it depends. It depends on who you are. It depends on what you're trying to do, and it depends on sort of what terms of settlement you require. And I think the notion of one ring to rule them all, that there's actually one correct way of doing transactions, there's one correct degree of all of these things that work across all transaction types, doesn't really seem to hold true. I mean, me paying for coffee is a pretty different thing than my business running its financial operations, which is quite different from interbank transfers, right? And so it sort of makes sense that there might be different systems, different infrastructure, different assumptions to handle those different use cases. And so I think that, again, that's a net positive, not a negative, that there are various forms of public blockchain networks that will allow and enable various forms of transactions.
Very, very well explained. Thank you. Going forward into 2022, what in this industry or in the world at large has really caught your attention, that has really got you excited? What should we pay attention to?
Well, so I'm a technologist, not sort of a financial sort of prognosticator, and the thing that really gets my attention is adoption and engagement, and in particular developer adoption and engagement, because generally where developers are building things, there'll be new user experiences that can follow. So I think one of the things that's really caught my attention, we sort of touched on earlier, is sort of real development happening on multiple different L1s and L2s, and protocols popping up and being available in multiple places. That's a pretty exciting development, because it demonstrates that there are multiple ecosystems that are going to flourish. It means that you're going to have new things sprouting up in other areas and cross-pollination. And I think at the end of the result, at the end of it, more choice is better for end users, and that's really constructive and positive. Two, related to that, we're starting to see cross-chain stuff really happen. Polkadot ecosystem, Cosmos ecosystem, Thorchain, and others. And so we're starting to see this sort of predicted future of interchain communication occurring, and that's pretty exciting as well. Certainly, all of the positive progress on the Ethereum blockchain with the London hard fork and EIP 1559, very constructive, and gives everyone confidence about ETH2 and the merge and sort of the upgrade there. And then finally, I mean, just public awareness. NFT revolution has really brought blockchain and crypto into the mainstream. You can be watching NFL football and see ads for FTX with Tom Brady. You can be watching NBA basketball and see NBA Top Shots with the Flow blockchain, and just sort of pervasiveness through popular culture. Just this week, Facebook announced that they're changing their corporate name to Meta, and basically saying, hey, they're all focused on the metaverse, which in many ways is sort of ground up from the crypto ecosystem. And so I just think if you compare our progress from a year ago to today, it's pretty breathtaking. And it also seems to be gathering momentum. And so it feels like 2022 is a pretty optimistic time with some regulatory concerns to be worked through as well, of course.
Yes, definitely. You have to have our overlords get in the way of our fun. We can't have too much. Before we let you go, Matt, this might not be a fair question, but I want to throw it out there anyway, just in case. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, I've got a small amount of an ERC20 in my MetaMask, and I want to move it, but the cost of Ethereum gas is sometimes even more than the amount of the token that I have. Are there any tips or tricks that you can suggest to saving on gas fees, even just temporarily, or how to get these tokens into maybe a different wallet that has more cross-chain compatibilities? What are you doing in this situation?
Sure. So we at Blocknative, because we look at the mempool, we actually have one of the largest and certainly the most accurate gas estimation service in the ecosystem. It's an API called Gas Platform, but we also make it publicly available via our own gas estimator. You can access that via gas.blocknative.com. We're actually just producing some new upgrades to that that'll include things like the history of gas prices, as well as sort of time of day breakdowns. And so, yes, gas prices can be exorbitant sometimes, and particularly if you have an NFT launch or something like that going on. But there are certainly days of week, time of day where gas prices relax and you can conduct transactions at a much lower fee, certainly at a low base fee and then with a minimal priority tip. So the first thing I'd do is look at Blocknative's gas estimator, identify times of day to conduct transactions and move there. And then two, the challenge is you generally need to pay a fee to get onto an L2. So you got to get in there first. But specific L2s, like Polygon, for instance, that's a Blocknative customer, can allow you to do quite a bit at very low fees with very quick confirmation time. So it's kind of like you got to pay the cover to get in the door, but once you're in the door, it can be quite a different reality. So I encourage folks to both pay attention to the great gas estimators, to look at times of day and days of week that matter, and then move to L2 solutions if that's something you're super sensitive to.
That's way better of an answer than I ever hoped for. So thank you so much. I'm glad I asked it. gas.blocknative.com. And where can we follow you for some more tremendous insights? What are your socials?
Oh, sure. I am M Cutler, Mcutler. On Twitter is definitely the best place to find me. And you can find us at blocknative.com. We have a lot to offer there. Our blog is really quite deep. And if you have questions about our stuff or our gas estimator, we have a very vibrant Discord community. There are links on our homepage in order to get there. And we're also at Blocknative on Twitter. So please do follow. Please do reach out. We love hearing from members of the community. And I would say there's so much to do. We have a lot coming. And so we love to get ideas and suggestions and recommendations. And so please don't be bashful reaching out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. All right, everyone, we'll be back in just another moment with another tremendous guest.